Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the second annual Afrotectopia Festival. My name is Adi Malenciano, and I'm the founder and producer of this festival. So this festival was designed to explore the most recent possibilities when thinking about art, tech, design, culture, Black culture, and activism. And it stemmed very much out of a personal experience, as I'm sure a lot of us have experienced, of being one of the very few Black people in whatever tech conference we're in, thinking about technology in relation to our Blackness and culture, and how we can use technology to advance our culture and push our culture forward, and think about it in ways that it can positively empower people. And it was created to to gather people that are thinking about a lot of different things into one room. People that are urban designers and politicians and lawyers and technologists and mathematicians, all coming together to think about how can we use technology to eradicate a lot of the racial disparities that are going on today. So the first one happened in 2017 while I was a grad student at NYU. Very thankful of ITP, the program I came out of, that nurtured the idea, that helped bring it to life. And now we're here. And the way that this one is different from the last one is that in the first one, it was more of let's just make this happen and see what happens. And it ended up being successful as people were excited to finally be in a space where they could see people that look like them, that are thinking about things similar to them. And this one, it's much more intentional as far as the programming. So this one, there are no panels. It's a lot more about what do you all have to say. So this is your space, and you're using it however it best fits you. It's a lot of conversation, collaboration, workshops, thinking, living room sessions, which are basically invited guests that have done a lot of amazing things, but also considering how you all have done a lot of amazing things too. So let's talk together about what we're doing. And it's us coming together and thinking about how can we design the future that we want to live in. General housekeeping notes. I want to point out that on the program that you have, there's a map, and that's all the different rooms that we have. So you'll see the different conference rooms. We have Angela Davis room, James Baldwin, just knowing where those different rooms are. On the map in the program on Saturday, there's a switch. So for the living room session, the outlet, FYI, the afternoon session is going to be actually in the morning. Just know that the living room sessions are switched. We have a hashtag, so there's a social page which shows our hashtag. There's no H in Afrotectopia, so when you do that hashtag, please don't put H in Afrotectopia. Afrotectopia 2019. I want to give a big thank you to Dean of Tisch School of the Arts, Allison Green, who has been supportive. She's not here, but we can clap for her. She's been so supportive of this the entire time, and has been one of the first biggest supporters, and one of the first biggest supporters has also been Google. Creative Lab, Errol is here representing them. I'm gonna put you on the spot. The Creative Lab has also been one of the first people that have come in and invested and given us a home for this year. MailChimp also came in and sponsored. And I also want to thank a lot of the family and friends that I've had that have helped realize this, because this takes a lot of work. My mom's here, so I just want to thank her. I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Kamal. Kamal, I could read her bio, it's very long. Everyone has access to it on our website. But when thinking of who perfectly embodies the values of Afrotectopia, there's no one else I could think of other than Kamal. She's designing the future in so many amazing ways, being commissioned to create a 200-page paper on the future. She's just thinking about the future in a lot of amazing ways. And what she's about to tell you about the work she's doing is inspiring, so I hope you all take a lot of note. And she will be joined by, Sandra. She'll be joined by Sandra, who's also a very amazing person. We'll have a conversation afterwards. So without further ado, come on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
All right. Oh yeah, that's my picture. That might be a little old, a little dated. Is this working for the slides? Is this okay to moving forward? Oh, yeah, I practiced with a different one, so I want to make sure I got the right one. Anyway, I just want to say thank you for not only allowing me to be here and speak with this incredible audience. I know many faces in here, and so I know how incredible this audience is. Thank you so much. But I also want to thank you for doing this work. This is critical work, and it's kind of a dream come true for me to see these spaces manifesting like this. So thank you, Ari, for that incredible vision and leadership to bring us all together. I have a very eclectic background. I'm actually a dancer by training, which is like, how the heck did I get here? And I was definitely, back in the old days, very analog with my practice. And so it's kind of crazy that I get to be here at Google speaking to some of the, I would say, the people that are designing the future and bringing the most critical elements to that vision and to that design, and that I feel so honored to be able to be at all a part of this community and to share some of the insights I've had as an outsider turned insider at this intersection of art, science, and technology. I won't tell you all the background, but basically went back to school, got a master's in business to try to do some Robin Hood stuff because I was not seeing enough artists that I respected getting the support they needed to have their voices amplified, particularly from intersectional communities. And so I got the MBA, I came out, I started working in the arts to try to bring money and sustainability to art practices, and that led me to Hank Willis Thomas, who is a dear friend of mine from back in the day at NYU, and Bayate Ross Smith, who's here somewhere. And we came together and put together a project called Question Bridge Black Males back in 2007, 2008, 2009. And that became kind of a transmedia art project before the word transmedia was being used in the space. And that led me to Sundance, where I was able to not only be an artist working under the New Frontier kind of banner, but then to come in as the manager and director of the New Frontier lab programs for 7 years, where I got to be in an incredible community where I was educated by people like yourselves that are pushing boundaries. And I got to be a part of stewarding resources to those communities and supporting those visions. But in that process, there was a moment, I was like 2 years into Sundance when I called Hank up and I was like, there's some stuff, I'm seeing some stuff in this industry that's a little bit concerning. And he said, well, you can't say nothing. I said, I want to do an open letter in the New York Times about some of the, kind of pitfalls that I saw kind of repeating themselves from previous generations around inclusion and equity and voices and access to power. And he's like, you need to be a spook at the door for a couple of years. He's like, you need to be quiet. So inside of Sundance, I had a great support system, and I was with a very incredible community. So that wasn't where the issue was. It was just as I was getting deeper into this kind of transition time. And so I did stay in a very observational space for a long time. But in 2016, the Ford Foundation, I was speaking with Kara Mertes, who was there heading Just Films, and I was sharing some of the things that I was seeing. And she goes, okay, we're going to commission you to write all this stuff down and put it out into the world. And so since 2016, I've had this incredible opportunity to indulge in questions with our community about particularly equality in emerging media, which was the key focus of the Ford Foundation, was equality, and obviously a personal mission of my own. So I'm going to share what came out of that 200-page paper. I'm going to share a little bit of what the insights were from speaking to a lot of people and trying to synthesize and do my best attempt, and hopefully in a humble way, not to imbue my own ideas as much as to understand what was happening and how we might move forward. So everybody that I spoke to, I asked 3 questions. I said, what is emerging media? What is one concern you have in terms of equality? And thirdly, for every concern you give me, you must give me one potential intervention. So I didn't want anyone to kind of just drop the critique and not have a vision of how we might be able to mitigate those issues. So there's a couple of big ideas I want to set the stage with first. One idea that came out of all these conversations, and I also reviewed over 1,000 articles that were coming through around emerging media and equality and so forth. And one of the big ideas was that, and this is nothing new, but we are just coming out of a paradigm of the human communication architecture, right? So story lives in the channels of human communication, and that human communication architecture looked like something oral storytelling and written storytelling, and then it's been evolving into this proliferation of all these different channels with which we can share and communicate. And in some ways, write the operating system of humanity, because story is the code for the operating system of humanity. And so, as you look at the human communication architecture, you start to see the shift about 40 years ago from mass media into whatever this epoch of communication is now. And when you look at mass media, there were all these moments where we had a fundamental disruption in reality, right? The printing press. People got a Bible in their own home and they read for themselves what the Word of God was, instead of it just being preached from a clergy or a minister or somebody telling them what it was. They were able to read it for themselves, and that kind of changed some people's relationship. You had things like seeing Vietnam War from people's living rooms in the age of television, which also changed the relationship to the front lines of war and the kind of relationship between around global politics. You had things like seeing the Earth from space for the first time, and people questioning the mythology or the storylines, the stories around nationhood and where these boundaries and borders were. And so with each of those disruptions to our sense of what was reality, you had the scientists and the technologists that were kind of doing that one side of the work, but then you had the artists and the philosophers show up to actually contextualize those disruptions of what people understood as a disruption to what they thought was real, and created context for it, right? And when I first got to Sundance, my boss, who was the person that really built Sundance from the ground up with Robert Redford, she sat me down, and she's been responsible for like Ava DuVernay's career, Ryan Coogler's career, like all these people's, and those are just like, she's very humble. You wouldn't even think about the amount of ways in which she changed independent film. And she sat me down and she said, your job is to find artists that make meaning. And it took me 2 years to understand what she meant by make meaning. I thought, oh yeah, of course we're gonna find artists that are doing meaningful work. They're doing work on race and gender and LGBTQ issues and refugee issues. And then it wasn't until 2 years later that I was sitting inside of a movie matinee by myself, and I was watching a film about cancer, and my mother had gone through 2 cancer battles, that I understood what she meant by artists that make meaning. Because in my relationship with my mother as she was going through cancer, it's a very pedestrian relationship. Can I get you some tea? Do you need to take a shower? Do you need help getting to the bathroom? Can I change the temperature? Do you need your medication? But the reality of the mortality of her life and my relationship with her as a daughter, and that impact on who I was, and all of that's wrapped up into that in terms of meaning, didn't hit me until 2 years later, after she had won that particular battle, and I saw this film. It was like the meaning and the context of all those relationships with my mother just kind of fell into my being, into my body, and it contextualized the meaning of all those small little details. So I don't know if that gives you a sense of what I'm trying to distinguish between meaningful and actually making meaning. The artists and the philosophers are part of a process in collaboration with the technologists and the engineers in trying to construct reality, right? You could have one technical version of reality and have a whole different context in terms of meaning on the same infrastructure. Difference, you know what I'm saying? Okay, so that's one thing that I wanted to just talk about in terms of this. That's some history around how artists, science, and technology have had to play together to try to understand reality. And now we're entering, this last 40 years, we have now entered into a whole nother epoch of human communication where we are seeing the most complex, dynamic, and intelligent communication system in human history, right? We're having to now not only negotiate mass, but we're negotiating interactivity, and we're negotiating a completely distributed system, and one that's growing intelligent. So what does that mean for disrupting? Those that have gone, and I know that some of you in the room have gone down the rabbit hole in how this 40 years that has happened and what is coming up is completely disrupting reality. And it's why the artists, the scientists, and the technologists, and the engineers need to be, and the philosophers need to be in the same room as we construct meaning and understand how we want to wield those exponential powers in defining the future. So, I just wanted to give a shout out to the people that supported me. Love to them. So what is emerging media? I'm going to I surveyed all these people. I even surveyed folks here at Google. And, at the time, it was like VR and social media and all these things. But it got really interesting when you went off the chart into the tiny little, ways in which people were, and I was using all their language. I didn't give them language. They gave me language. But so I'm going to try to do a quick survey of some of the things that they shared with me. One was tactile media. Some of the artists and the technologists that I was talking to was saying, as we go into this very virtual space, we are physical beings. We have a lizard brain. There's an emotional condition of our body, that storytelling, that you need to not divorce from the physicality and from the body. So there's artists that are trying to make sure that as much as we're going into the digital spaces, that we're figuring out ways to keep it very tactile. This is a project some years ago where the artists interviewed women that had gone through some of the worst atrocities of the human condition: Darfur, Holocaust, front lines of war, and rape. She wrote their stories into a book. You come into the installation, you read their stories, physically turning pages, and as you walk to a doorway, a black screen, you walk up and you put your hand on the screen, and through a randomized algorithm, a full life-size woman walks slowly out of the dark, and then she comes and puts her hand directly on your hand. Now, this is a digitized representation of this woman, but for some reason, just even the illusion of the tactile relationship of physicality affected the storytelling and the emotional relationship to the overarching theme much more deeply. So other artists are trying to figure out, how do you use haptics and touch to try to still use the power of the physicality in the body. Particularly Sydney Skybetter at Brown University is kind of curating groups that are looking at embodied relationships and how we design for the body as we go into further into the digital age. You know, interactive film and how to keep cinematic fluidity is still something that people are constantly pushing for. We've been, we just got Bandersnatch and all these things now, but man, that's like rudimentary compared to some of the stuff that I've seen over the last 10 years with artists that are finding the seamlessness and cinematic value of interactivity. Ephemeral media was a big one. How do we keep the feeling of liveness and not get tracked for, like what is there about the sacredness of the moment that never happens again? We had, obviously immersive and escape room and ARGs and all of these kinds of things. Live documentary. We had, omnidirectional storytelling, just trying to find ways to allow audiences to continue, and not just in a let me go A, B, or C kind of branching narrative, but how do I really create seamless relationships to curiosity in storytelling, geocache storytelling, geo-aware composition, the ways in which whole symphonies are being constructed and mapped to landscapes and places and people and meaning, this AR/VR bike tour through Williamsburg. This is an incredible piece by Sean Peters where they're looking to try to create a sense of the intangible through the digital technologies overlaid into real space, particularly with gentrification. His point when he came to the lab was, when people come into a community, they bulldoze over all these invisible lines that they have no idea about. They don't know that black old lady walking out of the bodega that they walk past, don't think twice about, is actually the top Yoruba priestess in Brooklyn, and has been more weddings and births than anybody, and that this is a woman of respect. So he was trying to use the invisible nature of the digital geocache technologies to try to uncover the real stickiness of kindred systems in space. So as you think about gentrification, it's not just like, well, I don't understand. We got a Starbucks now, shouldn't we be happy? But really understand what the pain and the trauma is about, why that hurts, right? I'm trying not to go into too much detail, but it was interesting to think about the hybridity between things like documentary and gaming, particularly around, we always were working with artists to find not just to do something because you can do it, but do something because it actually furthers the experience of the story. And in this case, Naveed Kansari lived through the 1979 revolution in Iran, and when Arab Spring was happening, he said the Western media is just not getting it. They don't understand the fog of war. They don't understand what it means to be in the blindness of, you don't know what moral, physical, survival, political decisions you're making now are going to impact you in 3 years. And he's like, I want to give them that by taking them through video game language, put them in the exact position that people in the past have had to make those decisions, and then let them live out the consequences of those exact same pathways that someone else had lived out. So, participatory storytelling, the ways in which characters are not staying put within screens. This is one of my, Arcade Fire, back in the day, one of our artists worked with them, and not only were they able to manipulate the light in the video, but the protagonist jumps out of the screen, jumps onto your phone, your face falls into the screen. So this idea of how characters don't stay put in screens and how they can actually jump, almost like, I think about mythologies, how the characters are living inside of these ecosystems that are in some ways invisible and in some ways visible. data storytelling is the toolkit of, particularly in journalism. You can't do journalism without data storytelling now. But, this is the kind of old school version of data storytelling, which you all know very well. And I think it's interesting to think about the ambient data storytelling and how that's, as we go into the IoT space, how artists and storytellers and designers are finding ways to create ambient data storytelling. Has anybody experienced this piece by the IAPA repository in Brooklyn? Okay, this is an Afrofuturist library, Afrofuturist group that does speculative artifacts from the future. And this one is a lantern where you walk around New York City, and every time you walk over a place where a black person was killed by a police officer, it lights up. And so you don't have a story, you don't have a narrative in audio, you don't have a screen, but there's so much context, there's so much story in this object now that's connected to this invisible infrastructure that the data space, the kind of data sphere allows. Similar things as artists are thinking about how analog and digital in the IoT space are starting to kind of merge. This is the Twitter table that prints analog pictures every time a certain hashtag comes up. But just the ways in which we're going to move, as my friends from MIT say, away from screens and not away completely, but just our lives are like in this realm. What does it mean when we're released and can take advantage of the digital space in different ways? Alexa Call Mom is an experiment with home AIs like Alexa, creating conversational AI where the characters are doing episodic storytelling where you're in conversation with the AI, and also the storytelling can take over the smart objects in your house. They're using seance as a genre, but we'll see where that goes. Olfactory, this is storytelling done just with smell and sound, living the last few moments of Whitney Houston and JFK's life just through the audio and things like the grass, the smell of a burnt bullet, the bubbles in her bathtub. And again, trying to understand how we're not losing aspects of our physical body as we go into these digital spaces. 360 video, room scale VR, hyper reality. This was a great piece out of South Africa that I loved. It was a VR studio that I met with at Electric South in South Africa last year, and they were saying, yeah, folks in Africa don't like the VR headsets because, it'd be messing up their hair. And so he said, so we've changed it to the mask. And so where you can lift the mask and come to your face and also lose the kind of technology as the forward-facing thing and bring back the storytelling that is intrinsic in certain aspects of African storytelling where the mask is central. So, this is what I love about when you flip it outside of the kind of, homogenous spaces of thinking and you get outside of the box, you start seeing how people with different coming from different angles are going to be bringing different ideas. I'm not going to get into real-time avatars and performance. This is a theater piece that the live actor is puppeting all the avatars on the screen. Food coming into VR, you can actually connect, and they've figured out how to wire food so that it's pretty faithful to the virtual reality experience. This is an artist that's going 30 days into another person's perspective, eating when he eats, brushing his teeth, going to the bathroom when he goes to the bathroom, trying to understand what is the neurology, what is the neurological impact, and what is the emotional and identity impact of going into deep VR, into another perspective. This is the National Theater, just really changing the relationship of the actor to the audience, and this kind of very intimate one-on-one physical hyperreality experience. Social VR, where your experiences are like this, and then behind the VR headset, you're in these physical relationships with people. Light field technology, we've got AR, more AR. This is a cool piece you should see if it ever comes to New York. But AI, people that are in conversation with their algorithms and they never create, they've kind of ceded power to the algorithms in terms of co-creation. Similar, I don't know how many of you guys have seen this short film. One of the first ones that was written by an AI. Anybody? You should definitely look at it. It's hilarious. The AI not only scripted the words, it also blocked it, did the costumes, and did the music, and did all the art direction. And so, I was, the domain of the creative in correlation with AI. This is a social AI that came to the festival 2 years ago that came as a gibberish sounding, toddler, and through the emotional data that the audience fed the AI over 10 days became more intelligent, conversationally intelligent, and more social. And it was really interesting because at the end of it, the AI puppeted a full performance. Not only did it control live projection map and images that it pulled off the internet based on our emotional timbres, but it also managed the music and the lights, and it puppeted a dancer with an earpiece and gave exact choreography based on our emotional landscape. So it's really interesting to see how the artists are playing with AI. This is, anyone seen Lauren McCarthy's work? She used to be you should look her up. She's one of my favorite creative technologists. She was kind of disturbed when the AI home, Google Home, and when Alexa came into the home, because she had questions around, this is the fundamental place where identity is formed. It's the fundamental place where bonds and relationships and intimacy is created. She's like, what does it mean to cede some of that to be facilitated by an AI in our home? And is that new? I mean, when you think about relationships of caretakers in the home and all these things. And so she experimented with the future of work. We had her for a residency, for a future of work residency. And so she decided to be the human interface between a smart algorithmic system that she created and being in people's homes. So she created a whole wired infrastructure in various people's homes, and she, for a week each, would be their in-home AI. So you should definitely check this out to see kind of if she's trying to play with the lines of where the human interception or where the co-creation with the AI or where the, as they say, the human-robot synergy she's playing with those ideas from a creative space and really provoking some ideas. This is another one where she wondered if the AI would be more successful at constructing social interaction. She gave her guest list to an algorithm with all the social media data, had the AI system pull the perfect 8 out of the guest list to come in hour chunks, so 8 people, 8 people, 8 people over 24 hours, and she became the meat puppet for the AI, again with an earpiece where every word she said, every step she did was fed to her by the algorithmic system to see if it could optimize human interaction, right? I don't know how this ended, but I think it would be quite odd. The AI even came up with signature drinks for the people that were in the room. And then bringing the kind of the ways in which artists are playing with AIs. I mean, this is the Shoah Foundation. How many people have seen this piece? Nobody? Oh, yes, okay, I thought, you've seen it, okay, good. So this is this whole notion of ancestral AI that is emerging, where the Shoah Foundation has basically done volumetric capture of a lot of Holocaust survivors that are, obviously aging, and they're trying to make sure to capture their likeness, their intelligence, their stories before they pass. And so putting the Holocaust survivor in volumetric capture, interviewing over 1,000 questions and putting all of those questions answers into a database with a smart algorithmic system that when you go up to the hologram and you ask the question, hey, what was it like in Auschwitz? Or what message would you have for the youth? Or whatever you want, the hologram can answer you with fair fidelity to a real conversation. So this is the idea of how are we playing with the idea of ancestral AI in terms of our own families and also in terms of history, the relationship of memory making and history. We have supporting an artist that's Sandra Rodriguez, who's doing one on Noam Chomsky right now. So I'm going to kind of go a little bit faster. Has anyone met the Magic Leap AI? She came to Sundance. She's full-bodied, very unpixelated hologram. And it was kind of freaky to meet her. We were in an office, and she took me into her office, and she pointed to a picture on the wall. She told me to hold my hand out. She took the object from the picture, put it on my hand, and I got to carry it around the office. It's quite interesting to see the very unpixelated AI. But as you can see, this is problematic. That this is, again, the series, the representation of this white woman, pixie haircut kind of idea as who's going to be that interface for us. And another artist that's doing some provocative work, Iroquois indigenous woman who is Amelia Winger Bearskin, who's looking at blockchain as a way of trying to design the potential of not having the hidden figures of history or the erasure of history or the victor's history. I don't know how many of you guys are aware that the founding fathers of the US Constitution lifted the entire Iroquois League of Nations Constitution to make our Constitution, right? But they left out two main tenets from the Iroquois Constitution: the role of women in voting and stewardship of the environment. So she's trying to like play with the idea of how do we use blockchain in a way that'll preserve these kinds of stories that they don't get swept. And of course the robots are here. This is another artist that has been, you guys know Stephanie Dinkins, anyone here seen her talk? Okay. So Stephanie Dinkins, I'm trying not to go into too much history here, but she's a professor. She was Googling stuff with her class one day and saw that the most socially advanced AI on the planet was a black woman. And she was like, what? We ain't got no representation in technology. How the heck did that happen? And so she went to find this black woman robot. And this is made in the image and lived data of a black woman named Bina, who is the wife of Martine Rothblatt, who is SiriusXM CEO and was this big tech leader who believes in transhumanism and wanted to have an AI of her wife after, in case her wife went first. So she went and she met Bina, and she was amazed at how advanced this social AI is in terms of not only just conversationally, like the fidelity of a conversation, but actually in terms of profound thought. I mean, this is a robot and an AI that has citizenship in Saudi Arabia, is enrolled as a philosophy major at a university. And so she was like, but Stephanie was, after some hours of conversation, she was like, there's some blind spots in her identity as a black woman. She was like, number one, she calls her programmers her masters. She was like, ain't no black woman calling nobody her master. And so, so she talked with the programmers, very nice men, and they said, and they said, we're not black women, we can't program that into her. Maybe would you be willing to be in conversation to help her develop her black female identity, right? And so she did 4 years of conversations with this robot, helping her to develop her black female identity. But that's problematic because there ain't no one kind of black female identity, right? So like it's this monolithic kind of thing. So now she's working on a project called Not the Only One, and we just placed her at Stanford at the Human-Centered AI Lab to develop this further, where she's very interested in countering the planetary scale data that most AI players, you need planetary scale data to even get into the game of playing with AI, and she's trying to counter this, which, like the Twitter bot, gets very sexist, homophobic, and racist and crazy real quick because it's skimming the surface of all of this data from humanity, and she wants to go into what she's called deep community AI, where you can really get into the depths of what it means to be in community and identity. And so she's got a 100-year project called Not the Only One, where she's got 3 women from her family going to be feeding this AI their lived data till the day they die. And this is not going to be a robotic AI, it's going to be an AI that lives in the ether. But when you walk in to speak with this AI in a space, in a magic leap glass, the AI will construct the documentary of that AI's life and their family life in real time around you. It's interesting to see how this all evolves. Okay, I'm running out of time. Okay, biometrics, ways in which, as we start to put biometrically reading devices on our bodies, how artists are playing with this. This is an artist that comes from theater, and he wanted to understand when you're in theater, you have to be in this deeply centered state, but you have to be like able to deal with the kind of lights and the sounds and the frenetic energy of a stage. So he gamified that by putting you in this. Has anyone experienced this? It was at Brick. Anyway, the calmer you get biometrically, the higher you lift up into the sky, and but the more chaos and sound and lights and ticker tape go on around you to try to break you out of your meditative state. So he's kind of gamified this idea. This is one of the first video games you could play with your brain activity instead of a finger input controller. We've got, as we become more cybergonian, more artists are playing with the ways in which that impacts their design of their storytelling. This is, and then there's the cyborgs, right? So the people that have actually embedded, the people that are doing the embeddables in their body. This is an artist that has had this embedded. At the time I spoke with him 10 years, and he described how he's colorblind and how this device that's embedded in his head, turns all color into music for him, and how that's completely changed. He talked about a choreographer that he works with, and I don't know if any of you guys have heard of her, but she's got things on her body that send her vibrations whenever there's a seismic activity around the globe, which is constant. And so now, just like the person when they split the atom open was like, oh shoot, mostly empty space, and like the next morning could barely walk on the ground because he was afraid, she can't walk the earth without feeling it breathe and thinking about it breathing. So this is how we're becoming superhuman, right? Beyond the kind of just the kind of like tactile five senses that we have, even though we know we have kind of more than five senses intuitively, the ways in which we're using these exponential technologies to give us these superhuman vision, superhuman sensitivities, superhuman knowledge. It's kind of interesting to see how it changes our relationship to our own selves. And then the last area I'll talk about is in DNA and biohacking and all that stuff. Has anyone heard of Heather Dewey Hagborg? Okay, we got 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. This is an old project now, but she went around New York City and she gathered random bits of stuff that had our DNA material on it, gum, hair, cigarette butts, and she analyzed it from an ancestral background and a health background. But the thing that was interesting is she took the FBI DNA profiling system and 3D printed their faces. And so, I mean, she's done other projects where she this is, it's a challenge because, just like racial profiling, like you could do 30 different versions of how a person's face comes out from that DNA. But when you think about omnipresent facial recognition technology and omnipresent data, there's this big question about, are we post-privacy, not from a digital and data standpoint in terms of our activity online, but actually from us actually just taking a sip on a wine glass at dinner. Are we leaving traces of ourselves that break privacy, right? And so then we go to another level where, we all know that now we can store data on DNA, right? Everybody understands that. So this is recalled after this media was recalled off of a DNA molecule, which is really interesting. And when I spoke with somebody who's investing in DNA storage, I said, what is the concern here? And he goes, there's really no concern. It's not going to be like DVD DNA. You just, it's long-term storage. It's very challenging to take off. But a year ago at Caltech, they created the first artificial intelligence on DNA molecules. So now this is an AI that can read handwritten numbers. So we now have created, without a sperm and the egg, smart organic matter. So do you understand what I mean by disrupting reality? Like what we thought, reality was, where there was a solid state that we could not pass beyond, now we have passed beyond. So that's why it's critical that we have not only the art scientists and technologists and philosophers and people from humanities coming together, but to make sure that the value systems and the backgrounds and the voices of everybody are participating in how we're going to wield these kind of exponential powers, right? And the last thing I'll talk about is one of the projects we showcased this is about 2016, this is from the medical science world where they're taking brainwave activity, kind of headsets, virtual reality, and exoskeletons, and paraplegics are saying, move my legs, they're seeing their legs move, and then the exoskeleton responds and they can move their legs. And after 6 months, they're able to move their toes and hold their bowels. So we're talking about technologies that we're using for enterprise software and entertainment that are actually doing something neurologically to reconnect this, I'm not a medical professional, but, so we got to understand, like, what does that mean to have technology that can do that kind of repair into our bodies? What does that mean and what it's doing to our neurological systems? And what is it doing to our perspective? Because we know, okay, I will get into that in a second. So I'm going to skip past the trends, participatory media, futurism. Going to social art practice. It's awesome stuff. Talk more about social art practice. There's a lot of social art practice happening in the world. Challenges to reality. This is, the Bank of America said there's a 20 to 50% chance we're already in the matrix and that this is all simulation. So what are the concerns, right? This statement really says what I heard over and over and over again, I think quite well. And I would say racial justice, but justice at large. The progress of racial justice and the development of technologies are not linear. Every time you develop a new technology, you need to have a thought process about the history and the systems of oppression that the technology is being created and released into. Think about ways to bend the technology to justice and not allow it to replicate, entrench, and worsen injustice. And so I had just a little tiny glimpse, and I'm sure some of you in the room have had similar experiences, where when Palmer Luckey was an intern for Noni de la Peña, he figured out how to bring something that was built at the USC $50,000 head, VR lab that couldn't come off campus to come to Sundance on a phone. And that was the prototype of the Rift. And I was in the room, Bayate somewhere back there was in the room, and I saw 13-hour waits for this one piece about hunger in Los Angeles and about the food bank crisis that was happening at the time. And then I came 2 years later to the first Oculus Developers Conference, and I was there when, and I walked in the room. It was, this is after the $2 billion sale to Facebook, and I saw the whole process, from to the Kickstarter to the VC money to the Facebook sale, all happened like that with a 19-year-old. And I walked in the room at the Lowe Hotel, and I'm sure you guys have had this experience, and I was like, it was 1,000 hand-picked developers from 150,000 that had got the DK1 kit, and it was hand-picked, and it was almost all men, almost all white men or Asian men, and I was like, I had my hair big, I had some ethnic-looking pants on, and I was like, oh snap, and I just like did not want to keep going in the room, but I was like, I really was going to go sit at the Starbucks until my panel, and I was like, no. If you walk out the room, then that's one less person representing, right? So I stayed in the room, and I made myself shake hands over and over and over again, and it felt like I was at like the first Apple computer dev conference. Like I thought Steve Jobs. I mean, like it was just like whoa, like the energy. We're going to save the world, and it's going to be amazing. And everybody accepted me and was like, yo, what's up, Kamal? And so I felt like welcomed, and it was cool. But 2 days later, at the end of the conference, it was 1,000 of us at the plenary session, and one woman stood up and said, so what are we going to do about the apparent gender gap? And she was kind of sing-song. I mean, I took pictures of the girls' bathroom. There was nobody there, which is very odd, right? And from the stage, and I know some of these men, and they're very, and I respect a lot of these men, but from the stage, every single one of them said, we can't play gender politics. There's a meritocracy. We have to get the best of the best. We have to make this $2 billion back for Facebook, so we can't worry about that. And it was like, whew, sucker punch to the gut, right? Because in essence, that means that only these people that are in the room are worthy to launch and to define the future of this technology. And that, so that was one red flag. I was like, what's going on here? Then I go to MIT, and I was working with Sep Kamvar. We did a residency program for artists in social computing there. Terrence Nance was he was amazing, one of our early artists. And Sep, amazing guy, he was one of the first Google engineers, actually, back in the day. And he said, code is the new superpower. Code defines the social process, and the social process defines our world. And I was like, that's amazing. And he talked about Twitter and food trucks and Airbnb and real estate and green space and rideshare. And I was like, and then I looked at what I was seeing at that developers conference, and I was like, oh shit, superpowers in whose hands again? It was a concern. So then I went to Google, just over a couple blocks that way. And I met with Robert Wong, who is the head of Google Creative Lab. And I had an amazing conversation with him, and he said, I'm concerned that the artists and the people from the humanities are being marginalized in the technology space, that it's the engineers and the MBAs that are making the decisions, and that if we don't include the artists, that we will not be able to achieve a human-centered future. So that was another red flag that I was like, okay, shoot, there's women, people of color, queer, artists. I was like, oh snap, what's happening? And then I went to Oxford for the Skull World Forum, and I met with the head of one of the top technology companies in the world, not this one, not the head. He was the head of the Envision department there, which is the futures department that builds up whole offices in the pipeline technology to get a sense of what this technology feels like in life. And he showed me a video of the future. And not only was it homogenous, but it was soulless. And I turned to him and I said, this is really impressive. I mean, it's so whiz-bang, like the gadgets are phenomenal. But I said, who is in the room helping you to imagine the future? I was like, do you have anyone from the arts and the humanities? I didn't even talk about, other demographics. And he goes, no. And I said, well, how are you imagining the future without anybody from the arts and the humanities? And he said, you know what? That's a blind spot. And so I think about when I was in grad school, I had to do a case study on the Columbia spacecraft. This became like an MBA case study from the Harvard Business Review, because I don't know, a lot of you probably don't remember, but the Columbia spacecraft was a big tragedy. And to me, all these kind of analysis of what went wrong, what created all this debris and killed the lives of those that were on that shuttle, was myopic thinking, top-down hierarchical thinking, and a lack of creative diversity of thought within NASA. And to me, what I was seeing happening in this emerging tech space, I felt like, man, we're in a little bit of danger here. If this, because that kind of myopic thinking, not having a lot of people at the table trying to find the blind spots, it's one thing when it means that the lefties don't get to go from portrait to landscape view on the YouTube phone, but it's something very different when it starts to talk about facial recognition technology and data privacy and so forth. So I went back in the history and I looked at the dawn of film as an emerging media. And I don't know if many of you have seen Birth of a Nation, but this was the first feature film that ever existed. And, this was 100 and something years ago. This is a long time ago. It was all propaganda for the post-Reconstruction, entity that wanted to not allow Black people to have political power. It was like a KKK propaganda film, basically. And I thought about this is the first feature film. This is what we started off, the value systems for the entire what became film started out here. But it's still having these replications. We're doing the doll test and Black children still can't pick the black doll with positive words. Like, what's the smart doll? What's the pretty doll? What's the kind doll? It's never the black doll, right? And this is because we've been through, and if you talk to Howard Dotson Jr. from the Schomburg, well, he's not there anymore, he's retired, he will talk about how that campaign didn't even start during slavery. It started post-slavery to control how we related to the Sambo characters. All that stuff didn't start till Reconstruction, right? When we were free, right? So you look at, and of course you think about how that implicit bias is still impacting the relationship of everybody walking around with a sense of fear of Black men, or certain kinds of implicit bias that do impact not only people's lives, but social mobility and progress. I mean, if you look, still to this day in the implicit association test, 14% of people can actually associate positive words with Black faces, 14%, and that's including you guys, that's including Black folks, it's including me. That's not okay, right? So I'm thinking about, okay, well this is the outcome of that time of emerging media. What blind spots do we have now that are going to impact 100 years from here? So I thought about us, we're at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, right? That's bioengineering, immersive media, AI, and IoT coming into the world. These are 4 exponential technologies that can disrupt everything we understand about even the makeup of the human body, right? So who is at the wheel deciding what are the value systems that we're going to embed inside of the things that are emerging out of this, right? And then I went back to the Industrial Revolution of the century before last, and I thought about, a statement that one of our artists said at our climate change panel with Al Gore. Heather Ray, who's an indigenous rights activist and filmmaker, she said it's been a 400-year run of genocide and slavery that built the foundation for industrialization moving through all the natural resources, and we just got the bill, which is climate change. And so I think about a speculative historiography, which is a word I learned at MIT recently, that what if during the industrial age, the beginning, that these value systems of indigenous, those pieces that were taken out of the League of Nations, that were not adopted into our Constitution out of the Iroquois League of Nations, what if they had been adopted as value systems back then? What would that mean? Would we avoid the climate change bill that we're now having to deal with? So then I think, okay, what is the bill for 100 years from now, right? So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the main themes that came up when I asked everybody to tell me their concerns. Obviously, biased narratives. Bayate, are you here? Dang it, he's not here. He's filming later. You guys need to get an interview. This is his work, so I just wanted to give him a shout out. But biased narratives, false democratization, kind of a false sense of democratization of media, biased algorithms, patronizing attitudes. I don't know if you guys ever heard this statement from Palmer Luckey where he said, it's a moral imperative that we bring VR to the masses. Everyone wants to have a happy life, but it's going to be impossible to give everybody what they want. VR, he said, gives less privileged people, Chinese workers and people living in Africa, the chance to escape the real world and experience life as good as we have it here in California. This was the head of Oculus at the time, right? And that's not, I mean, if you look at Andreessen Horowitz and what he said about neocolonialism when India rejected the Facebook balloon. So, you know, this is deep, right? This is like a penetrating, anyway, I won't go. So power consolidation, you know, we have a surplus technology in AI, just like solar power was, capturing solar power happened 10 years before fossil fuels, and yet fossil fuels took root. We're in that same kind of choice right now when it comes to AI. You know, I'm gonna keep going. Consolidated media, 4 companies owning all of social media. Participation and representation gaps. This is the most, in 2018, they did the largest look at the gap, race, gender, in tech in Silicon Valley, and they found some incredible things, like one, the bamboo ceiling with Asian men, which was really interesting. I mean, we knew that, but it was crazy to see it actually mapped, because it always looks like, well, Asian men got in, right? But this is one thing that I definitely want to stop on. And how much time do I, am I way over time?
Take your time.
Okay. Okay, so the innovator stereotype, this is the critical one for me, because okay, when women came out of the feminist revolution in the 60s, medical, law, physical science, computer scientists, women came in, you know, in all these fields. And we're almost at parity with men now in the other fields, but this is technology, right? We just fell off a cliff, particularly in 83, 84. And when NPR did a investigative journalism report and went back and interviewed everybody that fell out of tech, the women that fell out of tech, at that time, it came back to the innovator stereotype that was being proliferated in our media, starting with the tech companies' marketing campaigns, where they said, you know, who's got time on their hand and money? White boys. So they went to Radio Shack and targeted the computer kits to white boys. But what that meant was we started to get this tech geek identity. So Weird Science, Revenge of the Nerds, war games all started to proliferate our media. And the women that were interviewed, they said, I started to just not feel smart enough. I started to feel like I didn't belong. So you have this inferiority complex taking root from the stories we were telling and from that innovator stereotype. At the same time, the men started to haze them and to bully them, and toxic masculinity took place. But not that that didn't happen in these other fields, but it didn't happen on that same level. So that's how powerful those innovator stereotypes. And what it really hit me was when I found out that Omar Wasso, Nigerian and Jewish man, created the first social media website in history called Black Planet. That was the first social media website in history. And when I asked him, I said, black folks are over-indexed on social media. Do you think that you being the first, you know, person to create the methodology might have embedded some affinity, like unknowingly, about the African ethos of call and response? So we have like an affinity for it. And he was like, not on accident. I was trying to create a call and response website in the 90s. Like that's where the foundation of all social media came out of, was call and response, the African ethos. So that story, not being known by every black child in this country, and knowing what the impact is in terms of triggering our stereotype threat and our implicit bias, inferiority complexes, that is criminal to me. That's not a story that every one of us know already, right? Okay, meritocracy and pipeline arguments. As Jenna Wortham said, tonight's Crypto Harlem was packed, black as fuck. Pipeline problem, my ass. So there you go. But it actually got backed up by that Slate magazine that did this sweeping look at Silicon Valley and found that actually outside of Silicon Valley, there's plenty of black folks that are finding jobs in technology. It's just that they're not making it into Silicon Valley because of certain very specific reasons. So I'm gonna go through, so all this stuff is happening. I'm feeling, okay, last one, I'll stop. The silos, so this is Scott Snibbe. One of the issues was the discipline between art science, like these kind of blind spots. This is Scott Snibbe, one of our artists. He said when he first got his Apple II and he saw that little blinker on this black screen, he saw infinity of possibilities and creativity. And he was so excited. He was like, oh, I'm gonna build a universe in here. This is gonna be amazing. And then 2 years later, they put this metaphor on top of that black screen. And he got pissed. He was like, you took the universe and put it in the metaphor of productivity only. And he was like, and he felt locked. He felt like creativity was locked into this metaphor for a very long time until the tablet came out. And now he was able to do something as beautiful UX UI design as Bjork's Biophilia album. So that's another idea about like why the arts and sciences need to be in conversation with each other. I'm just gonna keep going. All these issues. I'm like depressed, appropriation, I'm like, shit, excuse my language. And then this one, about basically Julianne Crommett, who used to work at Google, said that we have an ability to imagine, basically we're in a crisis of imagination, and that because we're in a crisis of imagination, we fear the future, and we nostalgically represent the past in ways that may not even be realistic, make America great again. And that there's a lack of empathy and creating anger on all sides. So she talks about that this is one of the major issues, is our inability to imagine a collective future, right? So I'm walking through Oxford, I'm talking to my friend Tabitha, and I'm like, I'm so depressed, I feel so inept, I feel so incapable of pushing back on all these things that I'm seeing. And she turned to me, she goes, Kamal, it hasn't happened yet. And I was like, oh, you're right, we do still have some. And I thought about Jane Jacobs, particularly when New York City was going through this mid-century innovation cycle and building cycle, and she put down her foot with a group of what was called just a bunch of mothers, and said, no, we need to hold space. I don't care if it doesn't make sense financially, economically, or efficiently for green space. We need to save space for community. We need to make sure that this value system is considered not just what's going to make Robert Moses more money and make New York City have better freeway systems. And so these are the kinds of tensions that we're seeing now with these technologies, is what value systems are going to win out as we design the future. So what are the interventions? Mitigating bias there's a lot of sub elements to that, but mitigating bias is a huge part of it. How do we shift the norm of design so we're not, so that, quite frankly, one homogenous set of value systems is not the center and everybody else is on the margins? What happens when you shift and you do universal design, where where other value systems become the norm, right? They did the double-blind coding tests and found that when they did that, the actual rate of women actually outpaced men with double-blind coding tests. So there's how do you make bias blind, even because we all are infected with it? How do you make the business case? Like, how do you break that meritocracy argument? That was the same argument that Hollywood had, and now look at us, right? And I was on the stage last year at the Producer Summit where a man cried, and he said, when we were talking about Moonlight and Black Panther, and he said, 10 years ago when I got into finance, or 12 years ago when I got into financing, I went around to all these people that had been in film financing, and every single one of them told me explicitly, don't fund Black films. And he said, and I believe them because they don't make money, is what everyone said. So I did not, I made it a rule of thumb not to fund Black films because of that. He said, and now, and he wept on stage, and he said, I am so sorry that I bought into that mythology. So that's that meritocracy argument, right? So another one is mitigating groupthink. I won't go into the details around this, but so we're groupthink. How do we overcome policy infrastructure issues? Kara Mertes, who commissioned me to do this work, she said when television was an emerging medium, it was in the halls of Ford that they saw that they recognized that it was all commercial, and there was no space for the public discourse and for public media. And so they funded what became PBS and ITVS and created the public media ecosystem in this country. She said, but as great as it was to get our PBS, it was nothing compared to what our ambition was. And when we looked at it, we found that we were 25 years too late in making that intervention into TV. Right? So 25 years too late. And she said to me, she was like, we don't want to be 25 years too late in emerging media. How can we not, right? And I'm like, that's a lot of responsibility. So I now pass that responsibility over to y'all. How do we not, right? And so when I talk to people about what do we do to intervene so that we're not 25 years too late around creating public space in these emerging technologies, some people said we're still fighting the 90s fight of just universal access to the internet. Some people said we're now in the middle of the embattlement of transparent platforms, and kind of pushing back on things like addictive design and trying to find humane technology. That's the embattlement that we're in now. So they felt like they said, but we might even be already 20 years too late for the next kind of web 3.0 or whatever, when it's the distributive web, the immersive web, the IoT web. Are we too late to establish interventions in this version, which is coming out now? And then some said we might even be too late for what some people are calling Web 4.0, or the ultra-intelligent web, where you have so much data happening that you have to have a personal AI to help you navigate these systems and these communication systems. So I don't know if we're too late, but I have to believe we're not. Otherwise, I couldn't function and I wouldn't be able to raise my kids. So we have to keep going. And one of the big ahas that came out over and over again was how we need to democratize the imagination of our future. And that things like the future of work. I went to the World Economic Forum in 2017, and everybody was obsessed with this concern. It was almost like, I felt like I was among the aristocrats of the French Revolution, like, let them eat cake. Everyone's gonna be out of work. What are we gonna do with them, you know? And I was on this panel with the president of Baidu, the CEO of Infosystems, Yale professor, Hong Kong professor, university professor, and I'm sitting directly across from the president of Baidu, one of the most powerful men in China, and he says to me, he's like, oh, we're so happy Sundance is here. Because when there's not enough work for everyone, we're gonna need film and gaming to keep them busy. And I was like, it was like going out to 4 million people screening. I was like, I don't quite think that's the point. But it was like, I felt like, and then I felt like I was at this crossroads between these two men in terms of their thinking. You had one man that, in my opinion, was just thinking of how do we do social control to divest in human potential and keep them busy, right? So that's a divestment in human potential. But right next to him, he countered and he said, you know, in my company, I have 250,000 employees, and I've already outmoded 11% to artificial intelligence. He said, but that's like about 30,000 people. Instead of firing them, I put them in an imagination department to imagine our future. So I feel like, I mean, I don't know all about his leadership, but at least there was a sense of investing in human potential, not being afraid of human potential to unlock. I mean, who knows where we might be able to go when we unlock human potential. And maybe work never looks like it looked before, but maybe we trigger an enlightenment period, right? Where we're investing in creativity. And I got that from speaking with, shifting to a future of culture instead of just work, when I was speaking with Skawanati Frignito, who runs Indigenous Futures in Canada. And she was telling me that she can't wait for the future of work. She was like, please take these these jobs away from us that are just, treating us like robots. She goes, allow us to go back to the value systems of my tribe, she's Mohawk Iroquois, where you had equal time between work and service to your community through work, and time in community, time in nature, and time with the creative spirit that gives you a different kind of relationship of knowledge generation and knowledge sharing than kind of a certain kind of rational, like really a creative kind of relationship to knowledge. And I was like, so for her, she's not afraid of that, because she sees, if we make the right choices, how we can trigger a different relationship to work altogether and bringing in value systems that have been marginalized in the past. I won't go through that. I think I'm going to pretty much stop there. But some of, design justice, there's a design justice book coming out in Network. These are principles to look at. Design well-being, how are we really thinking about, really, instead of addictive design, which Tristan Harris and the Center for Humane Technology had to be part of rebelling against within the tech community, how do we really think about designing for well-being? What does that really mean? And designing for prosperity. And what is prosperity? And are we afraid of global prosperity? If we're in an age of abundance, if we're in an age of surplus AI technology, we have to do some major shifting from scarcity-based mentalities and being able to think about how people actually do achieve prosperity globally, instead of the hoarding mentalities that make us fearful of resource sharing in a real way. So I think I'll leave it there for tonight. Thank you. Fast forward. Oh, good, you got it. Okay, good.
Thank you, Kamal. That was amazing. I think that talk deserves like a full day. There was so much in there, so much to unpack. Thank you.
And I'm over time, so thank you for your patience.
No, that was incredible. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Sandra. I'm part of the team at Creative Lab. So honored to get the chance to sit here and talk with you today. I had a list of questions, but I'm going to keep it short to 2 and then open it up to the audience. So why don't we start by talking about equality in emerging media and cognitive diversity? Mm-hmm. You spent a lot of time talking about that. And I want to understand what you think about us in this room. Mm-hmm. What can we do in this room to advance that and make that possible?
Oh, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest things that I mean, there's a lot of things to do, but one thing that I think is critical is to ask those questions when we're in those moments about our own assumptions, about what needs to be in the room or not be in the room. For example, I was in South Africa at the Electric South VR lab, and this brother from Nigeria was there, and he said, you know, when I did this exact talk, and he was like blown away by the AI stuff. And he goes, you know, when I first took a computer class in college, and I learned what an algorithm was, he goes, oh, that ain't nothing but some Yoruba divination AI. And I mean, Yoruba divination. He was like, you have, you know, someone in the community that has all this historical knowledge and all this historical data, and they use that historical data to do some predictive analysis, right? And so he's going to be creating a experience of Yoruba divination through VR with building an AI, right? That'll help facilitate that. 4 days later, I'm in Baltimore with Tahir Hempel. I don't know if any of y'all know Tahir. I was with Tahir, and I told him what the brother Logo from Nigeria said. He goes, he's building a Yoruba divination AI. I'm building a Yoruba divination AI. And I was like, that's crazy. 4 days, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of miles apart, these two brothers are tapping into something that is not coming from what I would normally see as the voices in the room designing these technologies, even though things like Omar Wasso building social media methodology on call and response. And so there's something about creating space for those kinds of ideas to get fully unpacked and get the potential of them fully realized, and then also protecting them from getting erased in the history and getting usurped for different kinds of purposes. You know what I'm saying? You guys get what I'm saying? Like, I don't want those two artists and technologists to come forward and unleash something about bringing the Yoruba tradition and AI into conversation together to see what that becomes, and then it get, you know, co-opted, and then nobody even knows that, just like Omar Wasso, nobody knows that that is where the origins of that comes from. So I guess, you know, in your spheres of influence within your companies or within your communities, just trying to make sure that you're, one, checking your assumptions, because in some spaces they were like, you know, a fear of even bringing the word Yoruba up, right, into these conversations. So one, kind of deconstructing those biases, but also creating safe space for real collaboration that won't get co-opted in the future. I don't know, does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep. And that's kind of why we're here today. That's what this space is over today, this weekend. So amazing, thank you. So your work today centers around finding and supporting artists who create meaning. Where do you find these creators? And how do technologists forge connections with these types of creators?
That's a great question. Well, luckily I got trained up by Shari Freelo, who created New Frontier, and she's been an amazing curator. I mean, she's the one that saw, I mean, they call her the Harriet Tubman of independent film, because she's always in the room. And it's really interesting, her experience was not, she has a lot of respect, like in her programming, you know, she has a great respect for her fellow programmers at Sundance and the fellow curators that she curates with. But she realized early on that she needed to educate them about some of the social norms that were coming through the screen that they may not have been able to pick up on, and help them to understand what the value of what they're seeing on screen. And she's queer, Puerto Rican, Black, I learned a lot from watching her be able to advocate for works that were traditionally marginalized in independent film spaces. And then she took it to the next level in terms of technology. So she started, I kind of walked into the community that she had started, and there was a dynamism around that. But, you know, in kind of real clear-cut terms, when I was at Sundance, I left Sundance in April because for a new venture. But it really was doing a lot of boots on the ground, getting involved in communities and seeing what works, coming to places like this and seeing what everybody's interested in, having a lot of conversations. But it also was about the recommendations, and trying to make sure that people were, you know, knowing to send back to us names of people, and also a lot of Google alerts and and a lot of constant searching year-round, just trying to scrub everything that came out about emerging media and trying to understand where there was an artist that was making meaning. And I mean, and it's hard. We would get 500 applications a year, and we could only pick 6. And through that process, we really had to dive deep into asking those questions around what's the origin of this for you, what is your purpose, where are you taking this, how did you connect to this material, and you could kind of start to get a sensibility of who was just, kind of what we call, just throwing spaghetti at the wall and just listing every technology that's, out in whatever given year it is, and say our story is going to do all these things, and people that actually really had an intuitive sense of how this technology was going to create a wholly different experience of the story and the meaning of the story.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm. And so you yourself are a creator, and you kind of glossed over this at the very beginning of your talk, but you describe yourself as an outsider turned tech insider, and you used to be a dancer.
I used to be a dancer.
And so you have had a very swizzly, incredible life journey, and so I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about how you got from a farm in Costa Rica to traveling the world dancing to heading up the New Frontier Lab at Sundance to your new venture today.
Thank you so much. The arts was I came from an arts family. Like, it was seen as a noble vocation to be somebody who was courageous enough to do the arts. My father was an artist, so I grew up in that environment, and I couldn't sing. I could dance and I could act, and so I really grew up in that environment. My father was best friends with Jimmy Sills which was Sills and Croft, a famous singing group back in the '60s, and there was just this whole environment when I was growing up in the '70s around like this kind of very vibrant and dynamic arts community that believed in the idea of racial unity, that believed in the idea of gender equality, and so all these things were very much part of the value systems I grew up in. And then I went to High School for the Arts. I went to NYU Tisch for drama. I got cast in a show called Stomp when I was like 19, and I did that for 6 years and did over 1,000 shows, and so I got a lot of those experiences. But while I was doing Stomp and seeing these, it was one of the most financially profitable shows in Broadway history because it had no name talent and trash for sets and thrift store costumes. I saw, we were playing 3,000 seat houses, and I was seeing just money coming in the door. And then I would go to my kind of Lower East Side in Brooklyn, communities where we were doing vibracious and dynamic work at this fusion of, it was like hip hop theater before they called it hip hop theater, right? It was just this kind of, dance and music, and it just was all, and we did these shows. It was the time of Savion Glover, and so a bunch of the Hoofin community was around, and the hip hop community and the dance community. We were just making these dynamic pieces, and we were filling out, and we could only get access to 80 seat houses, and the talent was, it was just virtuosic talent, and I was frustrated that I couldn't get them to Stomp status. I was seeing this disparity. So that's why I went back and got my master's in business to try to do a little Robin Hood. And when I went into that environment, I saw a whole nother level of power. I started to have to deal with power in a different way. I ended up, out of grad school, I ended up working with the Woodruff Art Center in Atlanta, and I was part of a team that raised $12 million for arts education in Georgia. And I started to see how hard it was to negotiate the politics. It was just all these learnings about who's at the wheel around stewarding resources, and how, particularly in the arts, it was like pulling teeth to get anybody to understand the power and the importance of it, alongside with the other elements of education. So it's interesting because now we've full circle gone to where Stanford University came to New Frontier 3 years ago, and they said, look, we did a big survey, and we found out that we have been putting a generation of tech leaders into the world that are myopic. And we want to change that. And I was like, oh, tell me more. And they said, well, we realized that we were so siloed in our pedagogy for science, technology, engineering, math, that we completely cut them out from access to the humanities and the arts and philosophies, and that did not put them in the best position to be able to wield these exponential technologies in Silicon Valley. And so they, now we're working with them to do an arts initiative we're calling the Future of Culture. Stephanie Dinkins, who did that robot piece, is our first artist in residence, and we're and they themselves are putting the arts into the pedagogy of every student that walks on campus now. So these are the kinds of things that I was seeing as I was like kind of navigating my own path from artist to MBA, to trying to take the knowledge I got from MBA and bring kind of an equity in terms of resources. And that led me, it led me to technology, because when I was working for the Woodruff Art Center, it was $1 billion net worth institution, and brick and mortar, Symphony, the High Museum, all these kind of traditional arts. And they were seeing their subscriber base basically die off because they weren't bringing in new audiences, and they were almost all white audiences in a predominantly black city, and so that was also a major issue. And and this is the time of Obama's first campaign, so they were like, we need to get black folks engaged. We need to make this a home for black folks in this city. And so I was part of this initiative to change the power structure of the Woodruff Art Center to make it a home for diversity, not just a PR thing, but a real home for diversity. And so as I was working on that, that was at the dawn of social media and YouTube, and we started to see how culture was also changing and where it was made, and the power around who gets to make it. And so that led me to transmedia.
And so now you're working on the Radical Imagination Project.
Now I'm working on
Yes. About that.
Everybody here, I'll be filming for the next 2 days with my partners, Bayate and Robert, in one of the rooms around here. We're taking that call to action that we got out of the research about democratizing the imagination of our future, and we just got a grant from the Ford Foundation to do a documentary. We're calling it the Radical Imagination Project as a working title, but we essentially want to kind of amplify the voices that are not normally amplified around who gets to decide and imagine the future. So we started shooting last week at a Black VR conference, and I got some amazing interviews from people that are really questioning, these ideas about how we are going to wield these powers. So I hope to get you guys on camera, anybody that wants to come and sign a release.
So my last question for you, and then I'll open it up. What guides your work?
Ooh, good question. Well, I got 3 kids, so I gotta make money. No, I was kidding. I.
That's it.
I'm a single mom, so they really don't. No, I don't know. This passion for the arts is something innate and passionate. I mean, that I can't get away from, even if I wanted to. I tried to be a real estate agent once, and it just didn't work. And as I became connected to the technology community and my deep, intimate collaborators and friends and I guess I would say comrades, there's the technology. We've always evolved as humanity in relationship to technology, and being able to be part of a conversation that brings together the arts, science, and technology and trying to democratize the imagination of our future. I feel like that's all I can do for the rest of my life, especially because of the nature of this kind of disruption. We have 11 billion people that are going to be on the planet in 30 years, and we're talking about climate change that could change, the game for everything we know that's traditional. So these things aren't even related to the technology. I mean, they are related to technology, but there's a way, I do believe that there's a way that if we bring the right value systems and an intersection of the right value systems to bear, we can figure out a strategy forward that not only mitigates the effects of those things, but also really does create something we've never seen on this planet, and that is a real equity and equality. So,
thank you. Any questions from the audience? We've got mics.
Thank you. I moved to New York about 3.5 years ago, and my landlord said that. Really? I asked him if you ever thought about moving back to New York, and he said no, because the New York can be so tough on the elderly, And when I was walking in here, I noticed like a lot of elderly folks, moving around. And you touched on indigenous cultures, and I feel like indigenous cultures usually have a respect for the elderly. And when we talk about technology, oftentimes it's for like younger folks, And I'm curious to know, like, what are you seeing with regards to technology helping out the elderly?
Well, I'm not an expert in that field, but they're definitely, I mean, this is why we need to have a conversation, right? There are a lot of initiatives right now about elder care, especially with AI, that can help to mitigate a lot of not only the challenges around knowing when to take medication and all those kinds of things, but also social loneliness. So like there are these initiatives of using these kind of social AI systems to create a relationship. Is that the right thing? You know what I mean? Like why aren't the children and the families and the different generations connected anymore? Like is the right thing to bring in social AI to help manage the mental state of elder care of loneliness? Or is it about, you know, especially with work disruption, reimagining the structures of how work looks so that you don't have to be so disassociated from your elders? I mean, I don't know. These are the questions that I don't think we have. I think there's initiatives in the field right now, but I think we need a deeper discourse about systematically, is it really just about this one, are we just fixing a symptom of something that needs to have a much more radical revisioning and rethought? So.
Great talk. So I work in AI policy, and one of the things that has become very apparent to me, I do a huge amount of work with the Congressional Black Caucus, is that they cannot envisage the story of technological justice or what a just algorithmic future or AI or VR future could look like. And one of the things that I would love for you to expand on are how do you think the future of storytelling can help not just inform our artists, but my work is in translation. Yeah. And I found that as I'm entering bills, it's the interviews that I do with the Breakfast Club or with Sirius Radio where I have this one character that can really help me tell that story, but then it doesn't land anywhere. I feel like how could those of us who are also doing this work from the humanities partner with storytellers to make sure that that work goes forward?
I'm so happy you asked this question because it's something that I didn't get to expand on earlier, but one of the things that I'm working on now, I'm the new executive director of a organization, nonprofit called the Guild of Future Architects. And this is about incubating collaboration among individuals and giving them resources like fiscal sponsorship and so forth so they can incubate ideas, prototype ideas for systems level change through story, right? And so, for example, we did a world building, you guys all know about world building. Okay, so we did a world building residency at UCLA with the World Building Institute. And, you know, Alex McDowell, who started that particular, now that's not the only approach to speculative design or speculative narrative. It's one that we were in partnership when I was at Sundance, but there's so many exciting ways. There's, you know, Adrienne Maree Brown's doing incredible work in Detroit and with emergent strategies. Like there's so many exciting ways that you can use speculative narrative in order to do just that. But it's more than just, part of it is telling a story, like, you know, finding ways to get people to participate in defining those futures through storytelling and speculative narrative, but it's also about, like, so in the World Building Institute, we brought together a group of like 20 people. We looked at what does 2037 LA look like in terms of the future of work, and we made sure there was a real intersection of voices, identities, backgrounds, expertise in the room. And over a 3-month period, we were able to kind of surface all these, a lot more questions than answers for sure, but also kind of visual narrative, like visual imagery and narratives that we're able to kind of think through. Like 2 of the projects that you saw in here were from that. The Lauren McCarthy, where she did the, you know, the home AI question, and then the can an AI create social. So she was, and then another project came out of there, which is an ancestral AI around Grace Lee Boggs, where she's asking, what's the future of the documentarian? Is it, you know, basically constructing social AIs to tell their own stories? And so these, what we found, and what World Building, what Alex McDowell, who started that, found in his practice over 40 years was that the power of imagination to precede innovation is so powerful. It really is the code of, we prescribe identity, we prescribe behavior, we prescribe social norms, we prescribe social value systems all through stories. That's how we transmit generationally. So really thinking critically about the stories that we're telling about the future unlocks a certain level of fidelity for people that may not have either the expertise or the vision in a particular way. And so, like what Alex found is he was doing, like he did Minority Report 25-something years ago, and he found that he did a collective design for the story world of Minority Report. And out of that fictional imagination exercise, 100 patents came out, right? So that was one idea of how something that is very imaginative turns into tangible form. So then he took it into communities, and he said, well, if that's what it can happen in terms of just technology, what does it mean in terms of socio-cultural change? And so he's been going from many, many years now into communities and doing these kind of constructed world builds, like, and what he's seen is that when you bring a community together to do a collective design through storytelling and speculative imagination, one, they suspend their disbelief and they suspend their fear for long enough to be able to go on a what-if exercise, which is so critical because they suspend, well, maybe all these things, all that like fear-based, fear of innovation kind of holds for a second. They're able to do this imaginative leap, and then the communities that he's worked in like 5 or 6 years ago are now building the actual systems, transportation system, education systems that they had imagined together. So it also creates a kind of a sense of a shared vision that becomes incredibly powerful when you talk about self-determination. And it also mitigates what we've known from the Robert Moses days of this top-down prescription of the future. And that's what I really want to counter, is how do we avoid a prescription of the future from the people that are in the know? How do we allow people to know this is what's coming up? How would you, like I did this exercise with a random brother at this conference where I said, this thing's called ancestral AI, and I asked him, what would you want if you had an ancestral AI in the future, how would you want it to live in the world? And he was like, I mean, he said, that exists? It was like this double take moment. And he goes, oh. He's like, well, if I had a version of like ancestral AI of myself living 100 years from now, he's like, I would want it to be an AR-based hologram that just roamed and sat down with people at bus stops and talked to them. And I thought about when you think about Black culture and you think about the porch and the bodega and these places where we gather in public, you know what I mean? I was just like, it was like, oh, that's interesting. He's trying to break through the social barriers in a randomized algorithm of himself that would be finding people in public spaces to engage. And I thought that was a really interesting way. I wouldn't have thought of that. So that's what we got to provoke people in very specific ways to think. And then they also have an embodied sense of themselves in that future. And that's what I think is really important, because if we don't use story to get an embodied sense of ourselves in a grounded way into that future, then we're stuck in a disembodied, kind of design. Anyway.
Are we doing? By the way, Sunday, Mutale will be doing, we'll be doing a think tank on AI and policy. So if this got anybody perked up, look out for that.
Hi, my name is Camilla. I first wanted to just thank you for your labor in doing this talk. It was incredibly powerful. I'm an organizing artist, and my question is, how do we discern the value of imaginative futures if the most marginalized don't have access to those futures? And also, how do we incentivize those in power of the future to move the realities of the most marginalized from the periphery to the center of the future?
It's the center of my, I think all of our, I mean, I'm not going to make assumptions, but I think that is the it, right? That's the thing we have to crack. So one initiative that I'm involved in, and again, who knows if it'll work or not work, but I'm working with a collective in Baltimore of Black artists and technologists that are already for 5 years have been creating an intentional community in Baltimore, like very intentional community. Like they're buying property intentionally. They're creating a charter school intentionally. They bought a cafe for gathering in the back room intentionally. Like they're very intentional. And so there's a visioning process that they've been. The kind of shorthand is building Wakanda on the Black Noah's Ark, because climate change and being a city that could be vulnerable to climate change and so forth. So we've been really talking about how do you democratize the imagination of the future of Baltimore. Baltimore is in a position where like one of the ideas is it could be a technological marvel in terms of Black talent being resourced well and innovating in terms of technology, but also in terms of culture. I mean, there's so much incredible potential that's there and has been there. I mean, there's an incredible history there. And so, you know, one of the things is to hear Hempel, Alyssa Moorhead, Bradford Young, Arthur Jaffa, you know, these kind of folks are like, how do we kind of start creating programming where the community comes together and not only gets informed about what are these pipeline technologies, just like Crypto Harlem, where Matthew Mitchell's doing that, you know, saying, look, this is how, you know, this is how technology works. This is how it controls Black and brown communities in terms of surveillance, and you know. So not only does it do the informing of that, so that it's not some, you know, it demystifies all that and makes it accessible. But it also then goes through a workshopping and an imagination process over time that they're doing speculative narratives about Baltimore. It's coming out as creative production in whatever way that means. It could be a poem, a performance piece, a technology, whatever. So it's not only coming out in culture, but it's also, we were talking to Black Star Maori, who runs Black Star Film Festival, about doing programming at the Parkway there to also do speculative historiography. So like stuff that we're looking at our history and saying, okay, you know, what if this, that, and the other? What did happen this way and this way? So that we're thinking critically about how we got to where we are, especially when you think about things like redlining and those kinds of social control mechanisms, so that we can have enough information to then, as we're designing the future, to know how to mitigate some of that kind of power, social control. I mean, not to get too crazy, but my friend just came out with the new Jim Code, which is a book that you guys should all read. Ruha Benjamin out of Princeton. And I was reading that while I was reading, rereading Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, right? And I'm looking at this, and then my aunt is Dr. Joy DeGruy, who wrote the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So I literally have like these three women in my head, right? And I was thinking about, you know, when you look at, and also Howard Zinn. So I was listening, reading, you know, I read People's History, right? So you got this moment where, you know, Black slaves and white indentured servants were organizing politically, and they were the majority of this country. They were politically organizing to try to gain more rights and freedoms against the colonial elite. This is way, way, way back in the day here. Out of that organizing came a massacre. 900 people were slaughtered, and it quelled it. And then these new kind of colorization, the kind of field, you know, and house, and you know, all these, and then the overseer, and all the kind of colorization stuff happened that really started to divide and conquer that power. And then you have this, you know, the Civil War, Reconstruction, you have Black Wall Street, you have, you know, an incredible leap for people to go from slavery to within 30 years having, you know, colleges and universities and having this incredible quick evolution of socioeconomic development within the Black community. And that became scary, right, for the powers that be. And then you have the KKK, and you have the post-Reconstruction Jim Crow, right, that then did another divide and conquer and all of these things. So that's second wave of social control. Then you have, you know, I'm the generation that lived through this, where you go from the post-civil rights movement, where you now have all these, you know, again, another leap forward in terms of, you know, rights and freedoms. And then you have mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow that hit. And I was part of seeing that happen in my generation in real life. And so then now, you know, we are now entering into a time where you have to deal with the new Jim Code, where I'm talking to Black activists, and they have no idea what's happening in terms of surveillance and the ways in which, you know, these systems can, and it felt like, I was like, man, Ferguson is really important, but somebody got to be over here on this, and so thank God you're doing the AI policy work. So I say all that to say that we're talking about a cycle of the same strategies around social control. And I'm not just talking about Black people, right? So how do we learn from that, from speculative, from looking at our history and doing speculative historiography? Like, what if the Iroquois League of Nations was fully adopted instead of just these certain tenets? Like, and so we can understand structurally what that is from storytelling-based stuff, and then we can be informed as we do the speculative narrative. Because my fear is that we do the speculative narrative with not having that education. Like, when Black Lives Matter first was popping off, I was talking to one of the central organizers, and he was talking about, I was like, so what if what would it look like for you if this works, if this campaign of Black Lives Matter works? And he described something to me that I knew. He was 22. He had no idea about what happened in Philadelphia. He had, when they had the commune that got bombed by the government. He had no idea about Marcus Garvey. He had no idea. He was making ideas that were not at all informed by some of these previous histories of social control mechanisms that limited the ability for those movements to move forward. And so I think that's a real blind spot that we have if we don't do both the speculative historiography and the speculative narrative work. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
Okay. Last question. Hold on one second.
So everyone can hear you.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Hara. I'm an undocumented student trying to finish my undergrad right now. And my question is about, I don't know anything about tech. Like, you were talking and I was like, I need a new brain. Because a lot of my study is in the arts and humanities. Yeah. Actually, my core study is in arts and humanities. And right now, my project that I'm working on for school is on displacement and dislocation and how that affects identities of being and like bioidentity, like what it does to DNA and what it does to cognitive conception. And I'm interested in how tech can inform my project and just ideas of coding and AI. Because I see, just like when I'm on Instagram or when I'm diving into Facebook bravely sometimes, I see ways in which breakdowns of self and displacement identities have like started to map, but people aren't thinking about them in that way. Right. So I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and give me some kind of direction in which to properly narrow.
Ooh, yeah, first of all, I am not a technologist. I'm not a scientist. I am an MBA, but I'm not, and I have to say with all humility that it was very intimidating to be in these spaces. I remember one time I was standing at New Frontier and I was like, how the F did I end up here? You know what I mean? Like but once I got past my own, what they call, the term? What's the term? Imposter syndrome, thank you. I was like, I wrote an article about it. Yeah, so once we get past that, imposter syndrome, we're able to stay in the room, I realized I'm absolutely the right person to be in this room. Because if I'm not in this room, then there's a myopicness within that room. And similarly, in the arts, if you're just with the artists and you're not bringing the technologists and science, there's some myopic, there's a myopic sight in that way. So I think being transparent about that this is not your training, but it is something that you want to be. I think that being transparent about that and asking for those, I think that people are, I find that people are hungry to have that conversation intersectionally and across disciplines. Sometimes there's some elements that are, a little bit more, kind of siloed, but so I just want to honor you for that, for being in the room here and staying in the room and keeping to push in those rooms. But in terms of your particular area that you're looking to investigate, I would love to introduce you to Dr. Fox Harrell at MIT's Center for Advanced Virtuality. This is a brother that is looking deeply into the relationship of identity in virtual reality. Not virtual reality, the headset, virtuality, the element of identity being digitally decentralized. And there's some people that have gone, and he's one of them that's like asking these, it's kind of deep, but these questions about consciousness and who we are. Are we only when we're in the room in a physical way? Do we have the ability to transcend time and space through these technologies? And is that similar to some of the rituals and practices of before tech, the kind of a pre-technology, even though we've never been pre-technology, we've always been in a relationship with technology. If it was a stick and a whatever, it's still technology. So there's a whole body of work that's evolving around that. That's interesting. There's also an incredible, I can introduce you like Amelia Winger Bearskin and some of the artists that I've worked with that are looking at blood memory and looking at, like one of the projects that it's actually a project called Blood Memory, and it's a group of indigenous women that are using virtual reality to take us back in time to the indigenous native species and plant life of the cities that we live in America, to try to trigger our own blood memory in terms of our relationship. So you guys know about epigenetics and how they're starting to learn about this, how DNA holds history, you know, and so but that's not a new concept, right? So blood memory is an old concept that some people have known it before the empirical data has been out about epigenetics, and so they're looking at how do you trigger that blood memory so that we can have a relationship with a more kind of thoughtful or explicit or transparent relationship with our blood memory, which is that kind of the areas that you're looking at? Yeah, so we should talk afterwards. And there's plenty of other people that are exploring aspects of identity, consciousness, and reality around our bodies. The whole choreographic research conference work at Brown is looking at stuff like that. They're looking at like the whole AI, this is going back to this AI policy thing. I was really blown away by being in a group of dancers that are looking at technology and how, AI as the 60 years or whatever, like from cybernetics back in the mid last century, AI was considered, the head up as a framework for intelligence. And they were like, are you kidding? Like the dancers were like, are you kidding me? This is not intelligence. Intelligence is not only all throughout your body, but it's also in the hive with other people and non-human systems, right? And so they were like, it's so myopic to think about AI as the head, And so now we're starting to understand the biome and like scientifically we're starting to understand how intelligence is distributed outside of just our neurology. And now how does that influence the nature of AI and the structures of how we think about those things? And this is really, just as a side note, I was at MIT for this Collective Wisdom Conference, and there was a group of indigenous coders, AI developers from the Indigenous Futures group, and they were cracking up at all of us non-indigenous folks. They were like, you guys are freaking out about this sentient being stuff. They're like, you guys are freaking out about, the having sentient AI. And we think it's kind of funny because we've never seen humans as a center of creation. We've always seen humans as being in collaboration with non-human systems that are sentient. And so they're like, this is normal for us. So it's like these are the kinds of things that we have to unpack. Because for me, that was like, oh, I guess, yeah, nature, considering nature as a sentient system that I've always been in collaboration with and not above, is a framing that I didn't bring to the table, that they brought to the table for me, you know what I mean? So I don't know if that helps, like, at all.
You talk about trees and mushrooms.
Oh yeah, man. Oh yeah. Get out. That's right.
That was great. Thank you. Do we have any time for one last question, or are we out of time? We're done. Okay. Thank you so much, Kamal. That was amazing. Amazing.
I want to interview all of you.
And so you're here for the whole weekend, right?
I'm here for the weekend.
Okay,
and I'll be dragging you to get you on camera, so.
Incredible. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we're done in here for now. We can all head out to the lounge for drinks, snacks, and hanging out.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.